Lesson 2, your second screencast for Latin via Ovid, Chapter 2. I'll give you a little news theme. You tell me how that sounds. Maybe you give me your feedback at some point. But if I start the screencast with music like this, maybe it'll give it more weight and add a little bit more spice to the screencast. Welcome back to Lesson 2. Latin via Ovid. And then, of course, I can add some applause and whatnot just to keep it fun. So the book bypasses some of the basics, but my experience has shown over the course of about 15 years of teaching Latin to college students that most students have very little understanding of the basics of English grammar. I won't belabor these points, but I do want to go over them quickly so that everyone is on the same page as far as the terminology. So it's just a short review of some of the terms that you must be familiar with. I want to point out that there's 8 parts of speech. That's a pretty crucial point to this class. If you don't know what I'm talking about, when I'm talking about a noun, you'll be entirely lost, obviously. I lump them together as nouns, pronouns, and adjectives, because all 3 of these parts of speech, as I write down here, all 3 of these parts of speech are declined. That is to say, when you add a suffix to their theme, the process of adding those endings is called declension, and your book gets into the declension of certain types of nouns called first and second declension nouns in this chapter. Nouns, I think everyone knows the definition is a person, place, thing, or idea. Pronouns replace a noun. There are a variety of different pronouns that you're going to come across in this class. The most important ones so far are the personal pronouns. I've mentioned them in the last lesson, and your book has mentioned them. Personal pronouns are in English I, you, he, she, it, we, you plural, maybe you like y'all or yous, depending on your regional dialect, and they. There are other examples that you'll come across in this book, demonstrative pronouns. So far, the book has used hic as one example. Hic means this. That's an example of a demonstrative pronoun. You'll also learn reflexive pronouns at some point, intensive pronouns, interrogative pronouns, and relative pronouns. So relative pronouns in general replace a proper noun. Instead of saying the king, you can say he. That's the main point of the pronoun. Adjectives, very simple again, they describe or modify a noun or a pronoun. All 3 of these categories, nouns, pronouns, and adjectives, as I tried to emphasize in the last lesson, are all parts of speech that are declined. When you add the suffix, that process is called declension. Sorry, I don't know if you caught that, but I was interrupted by a phone call. Now, welcome back to our discussion of parts of speech. Live studio audience, are you ready for verbs? Yeah! So verbs express the action in a sentence. That's, again, not a complicated thing. I think everyone taking this class is familiar with verbs. Verbs, the important information for this lesson, though, is that verbs are conjugated. Unlike nouns, pronouns, and adjectives, when you add the suffix to the verb stem, the process is called conjugation, not declension. It's not really that important of a difference in the process, but the terminology is different, and you need to understand the book as you read along or as I describe what we're doing. And again, in this lesson, we'll bring up a little bit about verb conjugation. Number 5, as far as the 8 parts of speech, adverbs. Like an adjective modifies nouns, adverbs modify the verbs. Often in English they end with the suffix ly, slowly, quickly, gladly. I give you some examples. And of course, in English you say that you do something well rather than goodly. So some of them are kind of irregular. They don't all use ly in English. Prepositions, words that describe, as I put it, location, time, or space. The examples I gave you last lesson as well are above, around, before, behind. Anything that can describe the position in time, like before or after, or the position in space, like under, over, or near. Conjunctions are simple. As well, words that link or join words together or coordinate clauses in sentences. Examples are easy to understand than that definition: and, but, or, if, and although. Very simple. And then you have interjections. That's a word used to exclaim, protest, command, or express an emotion or sentiment. They're also used to add color or flavor to a sentence, and they may even stand on their own. Without a sentence, people exclaim and add interjections all the time without completing a sentence. None of the interjections have a very clear definition on their own, but their meaning is taken from the context. Examples include wow. I even had an audience say that with me. Hey, ah. There you go. There's another interjection. Or, huh? Or yo, or hey, or ha ha ha. And something like yikes. So there's your 8 parts of speech, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page with that information. When I use the term adverb or adjective, I want everyone to know exactly what I'm speaking about and to know the difference mainly between the declension and the conjugation. Now moving on to the points in Chapter 2 that you should now try to follow along with me. Chapter 2, Latin via Ovid. And my edition, which I think is the same edition that you're using, it should be. Please let me know if it isn't. It starts on page 13 with the structure. It says number 9. I'm going to label it Roman numeral 1 because it's the first point in this chapter. It points out in Latin you can omit the possessive adjective. The possessive adjective in English is my, your, his, her, its, our, your, plural, and their. So this is just like with and the in Latin. You often have to supply the possessive adjective to make the sentence sound like good English. The textbook provides the example agonor est rex, Phoenicia, et Europa est Philia. Literally, this would be translated word for word. Agonor is king, Phoenician, and Europa is daughter. That is not, again, a model of the way I want you to translate. Agonor is Phoenician king and Europa is daughter. Sounds awkward and not like English. You have to add words like he is the Phoenician king and Europa is his daughter. The point of number 9 in the textbook on page 13 is that Latin often omits words like his, the possessive adjective. You'll note that there is no word for his daughter in the Latin. It just says is daughter. So you can supply that to make that sound more natural and more like English. The second point in the book is not that important. Don't memorize this point. Don't labor over it and be disappointed when this description breaks down. I wouldn't even include it in the book, but I want to make sure you understand what is important about it. The book points out that Latin word order is generally subject, direct object, and verb. The problem with this simplification is there's lots of other words that can come in between these words, so it may be confusing for you. And also, there's no rule that says that Latin has to be put into the order of subject, direct object, and verb. That is a common organization for a Latin sentence, but by no means is that the only way that you can organize those parts of speech. The subject does the action, just so we understand what that terminology means. The subject does the action expressed by the verb, and the direct object receives the action. Those are both terms that I've used in the last podcast, but just to remind you, the subject does the action when you're using an active verb, and the direct object receives the action. For example, I love her. In that sentence, I is the subject, so I is doing the loving, and her is the direct object, so her is the person in that sentence that is receiving the loving. The subject does the action, The direct object her receives the action. This word order, though, I say is not something you should memorize. The arrangement of words does not occur. Also, you have to remember that arrangement does not occur with the verb to be. The verb to be is more flexible and usually does not occur at the end of the sentence the way regular transitive verbs do. The textbook introduces the word transitive verbs, which are verbs that take a direct object. The verb to be is not a transitive verb. It does not take a direct object. That is a point that will come up later, but it's worth introducing that terminology now because the textbook introduces it. The third point in the textbook, on page 13 still, number 11 in the textbook, is about the verb. It's about the translation of what the textbook is going to refer to for the first few chapters as the simple old present tense. The present tense is the first verb form that you'll learn, and really what you're learning, the full name of it should be the indicative present active. But the book will refer to it simply as the present tense. And for the sake of simplicity, I'll follow the textbook and just refer to it as the present tense as well. But for the long term, please remember that technically, the verbs that you are learning in these early chapters are properly identified as the indicative present active. That's a more complicated way of identifying it, so we'll keep it simple for now. But in later chapters, you will have to understand what the indicative is, that's the mood, the present is the tense, and the active is the voice. For now, when we're translating the indicative present active, I'll follow the textbook and just call it the present. The textbook then goes on to point out that the present tense can be translated in 3 ways. It all depends on what sounds best to you. When you hand in your translations to me each week, I've recommended that you hand them in by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. You may translate the present tense in whatever way sounds best to you. It's your judgment call. For example, in the sentence Rex amat deum, the king loves the god, or a king loves a god. In that sentence, you can translate the verb amat as the king loves the god, or the king is loving the god, which sounds to me a little bit awkward in this example, or the king does love the god. And in this example, I don't think the does is really necessary. The most simple translation that I could never mark wrong is the first one, the king loves the god. The book gives the example, the poet tells a story, or the poet is telling a story, or the poet does tell a story. All 3 of those are acceptable. And in some instances, it may make more sense to say the poet is telling a story rather than the poet tells a story. But it doesn't really matter. You translate it whichever way is the most logical and sensible to you at the moment. The third point in the book, or actually, sorry, it's the 4th point. This is actually an acceptable way to do the Roman numeral 4 in Latin. You may not be aware of that. It's true. I'm not joking around. Normally, of course, you see today 4 as that, and this too is acceptable. You'll see ancient Roman inscriptions with 4 marks like that, indicating the number 4. That's not the common way anymore. Person and number are the terms that are introduced. Person and number. So the first sub-point under that heading, person and number, is that Latin verbs, as I just indicated to you, are identified by mood, tense, voice, person, and number. Mood, tense, voice, person, and number. The book starts with verbs in the indicative mood, present tense, and active voice, as I just pointed out to you, which we will refer to as the present tense for now. And the person and number of each verb varies depending on who or what is doing the action of the verb. That is to say, the person and number reflects who or what the subject is. There are 6 possibilities for person and number. 6 total possibilities for person and number. First possibility is first person singular. In English, that's translated by the personal pronoun I. Second possibility for person and number is second person, that's the person, and number, singular, translated in English by the personal pronoun you. Third option is third person, that's the person. The number is singular, that is he or she or it. It is ambiguous. For example, if I simply write Amat with no other context clues, that could be translated as he, she, or it. You can identify it as third person, singular, but you can't necessarily say whether it's he, she, or it. Then you move into the plurals. First person plural is translated as we. Second person plural is translated as you, plural, maybe y'all, or yous, depending on your dialect and accent. I know in Philadelphia, where I grew up, a lot of people said yous. And now in Florida, I hear more people saying y'all. Technically, of course, the correct grammar today would just be you, but you may feel free to use y'all or yous to express the difference in the second person plural compared to the second person singular, which is also you. Finally, third person plural is they. And these examples, these 6 examples, are the sum total of possibilities for person and number. It's either first person singular, second person singular, third person singular, or first person plural, second person plural, or third person plural. When you identify a verb, you identify it by mood, tense, voice, person, and number. For example, this verb that I wrote up here, amat, is the indicative, present, active, mood, tense, and voice, and then person and number is third person singular. Again, I don't expect you to have this information memorized immediately, but write down this terminology, practice with the terminology, rewatch this podcast, and read and reread the lesson in the book if you don't already know this terminology or if you're not familiar with it. These podcasts, again, I've reminded you, can go on rather long because the information in the book is significant. So if it's too much, pause, read the book, do some of the exercises, and come back to the podcast so that you're not overwhelmed with too much information. I think it's better that I do one podcast per week. Sometimes I'll do more than one, but I don't want to put up 5 or 6 podcasts per week, and then it'll just become maybe confusing to keep track of each lesson. I point out here that each possibility of those 6 possible persons and numbers is indicated by the personal suffix that's added to the end of the verbal theme. So you can see that I could change amat, which means he, she, or it loves. I can change amat, I can change the personal suffix, and instead of having a T on the end, I can put an S on the end. Amas. That would now mean you singular, love. And that would be the second person singular. I could change the ending so that it was mus. M-U-S. Sorry, that's a little bit sloppier than I wanted it to be. I think my writing's gotten a little bit better from last week as I adjust to using the stylus on this particular app. If I change it, the ending to amamus, that would then change the person and number to first person plural. We love, which is first person plural. So it's the endings that indicate which person and number. It is the so-called personal suffix added to the end of a verbal theme. Here's the theme, and here's the personal suffix. And that tells you which person and number. That tells you the whether it's first person singular or plural, second person singular or plural, third person singular or plural. Your book so far makes it easy for you. So far the book only teaches you the third singular and the third plural. For example, desiderat means he, she, or it desires, whereas desiderant means they desire. Note that this ends with a T and this ends with an NT. That's how you can tell the difference between the third singular, he, she, or it, and the third plural, which is they. The ending on the verb. Another example the book gives, or I can give to you, is portat, he, she, or it carries. See, it ends with a T, just like desiderat. That means it is third person singular. As I move on with these podcasts, I will provide more time for you to think and reflect on this information so that you're not just passively learning the information. However, in the beginning, I'm trying to get everyone on the same page and move at a reasonable pace so we can get started with the class. And here's another example, portant. You can see that the ending is the third person plural, they carry. Spectat, third person singular, spectant, third person plural. That's the difference between the endings of the third person singular and the third person plural, and that's all that the book gives you so far for person and number. The next point, the spacing is not good on it. When I import my Google Docs into this app, sometimes the spacing is not elegant, so I'll try to figure out how to make that look a little bit better. But the next point is about the possessive case ending, and at this point you're at page 14 in Latin via Ovid, number 13, the genitive case. So the possessive case ending is the genitive case. In English, you add an apostrophe S to a word to indicate possession. For example, this is the girl's book, and that apostrophe S is really the same as a case ending. It is, in fact, a case ending that you add in English. You may not think about it like that, but remember, as you read in the introduction, English and Latin are both derived from the same mother tongue, Proto-Indo-European. It's about 6,600 years ago that language was hypothetically or theoretically spoken. We can't know for sure, but that's what linguists would argue. And so English, because it's also an Indo-European language, also uses case endings. A lot of them have gone away in English, but they haven't in Latin. You can see that in English it is grammatically or stylistically appropriate, depending on your style manual, to use apostrophe S even after an S. But lots of people just use the S with no ending for the plural. But in both examples here, this is the singular and this is the plural case ending in English that indicate possession. You could also express in English possession using the word of. I would prefer in general that your translations of the genitive case ending use of in this text, because the genitive is not only used for the possessive. Your textbook starts with the simple use of the genitive case ending, which is for possession. But there's other uses of the genitive, and if you always use of for the genitive, you'll never be wrong. So I want you to associate that word of with the possessive case ending in Latin with the word the genitive. So you could say, instead of this is the girl's book, you could say this is the book of the girl. A little bit more awkward in English, I agree, I admit that. But I want you to use that if you can, because it's a better system to remember what the genitive is used for. And then of course you can say in the plural, these are the books of the girls. I like of for this class better than apostrophe S. When I see apostrophe S, this is what I want you to think. So try to use of. It'll make things much simpler in this class. In Latin, instead of adding an ending that is an apostrophe S, you add the ending called the genitive. And of course, you can add, just like in English, the genitive singular or the genitive plural case ending. In English, it's apostrophe S in either case. In Latin, the singular and the plural case endings are different. At this point, I have to have a bit of a digression so you understand how to add these endings. There are 5 classes of noun in Latin. I mentioned this last time. Each type of noun is called a declension. That may be confusing because we use that terminology elsewhere. But each class is called a declension. So there's the first declension, the second declension, the third declension, the so-called third I declension, and the fourth declension. There are 5 of these declensions, third and third I being very similar, so they're named to remind you of that fact. Just like there happen to be 5 conjugations, the first conjugation, the second conjugation, the third conjugation, the fourth conjugation, and the fifth declension for verbs. So each different type or grouping of noun that have something in common with each other is a different declension. So far, in these first 2 chapters, the book uses the first declension and the second declension. And that's where most books start. The genitive singular ending for a first declension noun is A, E. You would add that suffix to the end of a noun. I'll show you examples below. The genitive plural ending for a first declension noun is A-R-U-M. That's the suffix that you would add to the end of a noun to express possession for a plural noun. The genitive singular ending for a second declension noun is I, and the genitive plural for a second declension is O-R-U-M. Note that there is some correspondence here. The plural for a second declension is O-R-U-M. The plural for a first declension is A-R-U-M. Here's some examples so you can see that. First declension genitive singular, puellae. You see that the singular has an AE ending on it. That is going to translate to of the girl. You could add an apostrophe S and say girls, but I want you to avoid that in this class. First declension genitive plural, A-R-U-M, of the girls. For example, that is the book of the girls. Second declension genitive singular. There's the I that you add for the ending on the end. That would mean of the bull or the bulls. Those are the horns of the bull. And the second declension plural, you add O-R-U-M. Of the bulls in the plural. So number 7, which again is poorly spaced. I'll give a sound effect for that as well. It's my fault. I can boo myself for that. But let's review now the case endings for nouns of the first and second declension. You've actually learned almost all of them in this book so far. And we definitely need to review them so that you're familiar with all of them. I'll fill out the rest on this chart since the page got cut off by writing it, but I'll start up here. These are examples of the first declension. That's a certain category of noun. I can't write up that high. That's a certain category of noun that you're learning right now. The first declension. They have characteristics that are shared between them, and it's very simple. You'll identify the pattern very easily. Puella is the nominative singular, and that is used for the subject of the sentence. The next one, puellae, is the genitive singular. See how the ending has changed from A to AE. This AE is like an apostrophe S or like the word of in English. The genitive singular. In this language course, you'll always do the singular first and then the plural second. The genitive singular is used for possession, and you'll translate that with the word of in English, even though sometimes it may be a little bit more awkward than the apostrophe S. The next case ending in the traditional American way of ordering the declensional endings is the dative. You have not learned that ending yet for this class. So we'll skip that, but it's going to go in this order, so I'll let you be aware of that. Then you learn the accusative. See, it has a different ending yet again. That's the accusative singular. All of these names are case endings. The accusative singular is used for the direct object of the verb. Whatever the verb is directly acting upon is the direct object. And then the last case ending that you know so far is the ablative. Puella, with a long A. Note that the nominative is spelled the same, but it does not have a long A. This is pronounced puella. This is pronounced puella. Puella from the top, that's the nominative subject. Puellae, that's the genitive singular for possession. You're missing the dative. Puellam for the accusative singular, that's the direct object. And puella, that's the ablative singular. That is for the object of the preposition. That is for words that follow words like by, from, with, in, at, and on. You'll find that that list of prepositions right there is a useful way to translate the ablative when it's used by itself. It's a list. It's a word just like it's a list of words just like the word of for the dative. That will be very useful as this class continues when you're translating the ablative. Don't forget also, as this podcast goes by, to pause it. I'm presenting the information in a condensed way as possible, but you obviously may need to pause this to either rewind or to write down the notes as I've written them. So far I've given you the case endings for a first declension noun in the singular only. Here are the remainder from the last screen, so we'll skip over that. And now here are the plural endings. Puellae, that is a nominative plural. That is used for your subject when your subject is plural. This word still means girls, but now it's plural, and you can use that for the subject of the sentence. And you should also note that this is exactly the same as the genitive ending. You cannot tell the difference between the genitive singular and the nominative plural. Generally, you can from context, but out of context, you cannot tell the difference between these endings. Don't be frustrated by that. It really is rather simple when you see the words in context. The genitive plural, which you saw earlier, is arum. You translate that with of. It's used for possession. You have not learned the dative yet. Puellas is the accusative plural. That's for the direct object of the sentence. Again, it just translates as girls in English, but the way that it's used in the sentence means that it would have to receive the action. For example, I see the girls. You would say video, I see in Latin, puellas, because they're receiving that action. They're the ones that are being seen. And then puellis is the ablative plural. That's the object of the preposition. And again, generally, you'll find that the words by, from, with, in, within, at, or on are very useful for translating the ablative. They're not the exclusive list, but they're the top words that prepositions that you'll use to translate the ablative as this class continues. In this chapter, the book also introduces the second class of nouns, which is called the second declension. And I've shown you the genitive earlier, but again, we should review all of the case endings you're expected to know for the second declension. You saw that the first declension tended to have the letter A. For example, in the nominative, it ends with A. The genitive has AE. The dative, you'll see, is also AE. The accusative is AM. And the ablative is a long A in the singular. You can see immediately that the second declension does not end with A's, and that's how you tell the first declension from the second declension. The pattern of the first declension tends to have an A in the end, whereas the second declension uses U or I or O. It varies greatly in comparison to the first declension, but it is consistent within the second declension. There are thousands of nouns in Latin that fall into this category of the second declension. They follow the pattern of the word Taurus. Taurus ends in US for the nominative. That means it's the subject of the sentence. It ends in I for the genitive. That means it's the possession. It's expressing possession. You don't know the dative yet officially. Taurum is the accusative for the direct object, the one thing that receives the action of the verb. Tauro with a long O. Again, you should have a long mark over that O. That is the ablative singular. It's the object of the preposition. Translate generally with by, from, within, at, or on. And then the plural of the second declension. The case ending for the nominative plural is I. The case ending for the genitive plural is ORUM. You don't know the dative yet. The case ending for the accusative plural is OS. The case ending for the ablative plural is IS. While it may seem like an overwhelming amount of information to memorize now, the declensional endings have to be memorized as soon as possible. This is something that you should start drilling yourself on this week. The textbook takes it relatively slow as far as what you actually have to apply in the exercises. But in order to understand and read Latin fluently, or with any kind of success, in order to get an A or a B or even a C in this class, you're going to have to learn the case endings as soon as possible. They may seem overwhelming at first, but if you drill yourself with them over the course of maybe 2 weeks, maybe 5 or 10 minutes a day, I think you'll have them down with no problem, first and second declension. That's been my experience in the past. You spend maybe 5 days a week, spend maybe 5 or 10 minutes with some flashcards or looking over your notes, practice writing out different examples in the book, different first declension nouns and different second declension nouns, adding these endings, and I think you'll memorize them pretty quickly. At a later point, I will give a lesson on how to add these endings in a kind of technical way, but it would not hurt for you to try to start learning them now. The examples on the textbook, it points out on page 15, number 14, a very important point, that nouns and the adjectives that modify them always agree, that is to say, they always have the same case ending, number, and gender. In this course, I will always refer to those three things in the same order: case, number, and gender. And a noun, which is modified by an adjective, will have the same exact case ending, number, and gender. The nouns and adjectives do not have to be from the same declensional class, Remember I told you that there's a first declension, a second declension, a third I, and a fourth declension. There's different categories. I remember I mentioned to you that the first declension tends to have A at the end, as in puella right here, whereas the second declension does not have the A. So nouns and adjectives have to agree in case ending, gender, and number, but they do not have to be from the same declensional category. Again, that point may sound confusing. Now, bear with me. This is the first weeks of the class. As we sort these things out and you do the exercises, this will become more clear. Look at the examples I have that show how nouns agree with the adjectives that modify them in case ending, number, and gender. Remember, the case ending means nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, singular and plural is the number, and then the gender, as I mentioned in the first podcast, can be masculine, feminine, or neuter. So look at the example right here. Taurus novus est Jupiter. Latin, of course, isn't a spoken language, but I am modeling for you the pronunciation, and you should probably practice the pronunciation as well. You won't have to do any spoken Latin in this class, but if you also add an oral and an oral element to your regular studying, it will help you learn faster. So this sentence right here says, Taurus novus est Jupiter. The noun, Taurus, the bull, and the adjective, novus, agree in case, number, and gender. They happen to both be second declension, but that's just a coincidence. They do not have to be from the same declensional category. They can be, but they don't have to be. In this case, they're both second declension nouns and second declension adjectives. So it says, the bull strange is Jupiter. Reading from left to right, which you cannot really do in Latin or it sounds awkward. Bull strange is Jupiter. Natural English sentence would say, the strange bull is Jupiter. Taurus has a nominative case ending. It is singular, and it is masculine. Novus, therefore, has to be nominative, singular, and masculine as well. Same case ending, number, and gender. Look at the second example. The second example says, puella, parva, taurum, novum, spectat. So it says, puella, parva, taurum, novum, spectat. The girl, puella, parva, little, sees, spectat, bull, strange. Reading in awkward word order, it comes out very nicely if you rearrange the word order to say, the little girl sees the strange bull. So parva is an adjective modifying puella, and puella is nominative, singular, and feminine. So parva, the adjective, has to be nominative, singular, and feminine. Taurum, on the other hand, taurum is accusative, singular, masculine, and so novum, the adjective that describes it, has to also be accusative, singular, masculine. Again, in this case, parva and puella both happen to be first declension, but they don't need to be. It's just a coincidence, and the book is keeping it simple. Taurum, novum also happen to be second declension, but again, it's a coincidence, and the book is keeping it simple for you. The third example says, cum tauru novu ludit. Ludit means she plays. Cum means with. Bull, strange. In good English word order, it says she plays with the strange bull. Note that tauro is in the ablative, singular, masculine, And so the adjective that modifies it, no-o, has to also be in the ablative, singular, masculine. Adjectives and nouns agree in case, number, and gender. Point number 7 is that the preposition in, which is the same as in English, can be used with the accusative case, or it can be followed by the ablative case. When in is followed by the accusative case, it means into in English. When it's followed by the ablative case, it means in or on. Slight difference there. The first example says, Tyrus est in Phoenicia. Tyre is in Phoenicia. This is an ablative Phoenicia, and therefore, when in is followed by the ablative, it means in or on. In this case, on is not right. It would sound ridiculous to say Tyre is on Phoenicia or Phoenicia in English. So you say in. You substitute whichever one sounds most natural to your ear. In this example, Europa est in Taurum. In this case, I would say it makes more sense. Europa in the myth rides on the bull's back. It makes more sense, therefore, to say Europa is on the bull. Oh, sorry, that's my typo right there. This should be in the ablative again. So it would say Europa est in Tauro with a long O. Europa is on the bull because when it's followed by the ablative, again, the ablative, my typo, should say Europa est in Tauro with a long O at the end, second declension. That should say Europa is on the bull because that makes more sense than in this example. And then finally you have Taurus puellum in terram novum portat. This says the bull carries the girl into a strange land. The bull, Taurus, carries, main verb, the girl, direct object, into a new land. In plus the accusative, terram novum, it translates in English as into, rather than in or on, which is for the ablative. Note that terram and novum are adjectives and noun combination, is an adjective and noun combination, and therefore it agrees in case, number, and gender. Terram is accusative, singular, feminine. Terram is accusative, singular, and feminine. And novum is also accusative, singular, and feminine. That's the main points of Chapter 2. The book points out to you another minor point that many times the present tense is used to tell a story vividly in the past time. That's not a crucial element of this class. Don't worry about such minor points of translation. You may translate in this class awkwardly and very literally to a point, but I don't want you to translate in a way that does not sound like English. You have to negotiate between being literal and proving to me that you understand the translation, but also being faithful to what good English sounds like. So rearrange the words in good English word order, add the and their and the possessive adjectives my, mine, you, yours, his, and her when appropriate. And with that, I'll play you some outro music, and this is me saying goodbye. Talk to you next time.